I seek a name before I make my mark, and kill the guards while creeping in the dark. I gorge your drives until the space is dead, and leave a void of zeros in my stead. No ransom note or coin will stay my hand. I break the pipes that flow across the land, a sudden strike that brings a silent night. What code am I that takes the system's light? Welcome back to CyberSecureOT. I'm your host, Dennis, and in today's episode, we are looking at the critical intersections of supply chain vulnerabilities, destructive malware, and the evolving frameworks designed to keep our industrial control systems running. Here is a breakdown of what we are covering today. Segment 1, The Silence of the Zeros. We like to open with a dramatized narrative detailing the fall of the Petroleos de Venezuela refinery, PDVSA. We use this techno-thriller scenario to translate abstract cyber threats into a visceral reality and to stress test the core methodology. In segment 2, The Supply Chain Contamination, we examine the recent Bitwarden CLI compromise to understand how modern digital supply lines are weaponized. We break down how attackers leverage a compromised GitHub action to scrape developer environments for critical credentials and AI configurations, creating an existential threat to the OT CI/CD pipelines. Now, segment 3, Precision Destruction. Putting on our gray hats, we take a technical deep dive into the Lotus malware that struck Venezuela's energy sector. We analyze the threat model behind this unrecoverable system destruction, from its hard-coded domain targeting to its use of living off the land binaries to autonomized data. In segment 4, finally, Turning the Lights On, we tackle the foundational challenge of operational technology, visibility. We explore how CISA's asset inventory guidance alongside the new NIST and NCCOE projects, including the Cyber AI Profile, provides practitioners with the practical architectures needed to secure the plant floor. So grab your coffee, check your logs, and let's get right into the latest OT cybersecurity news. The air conditioning in the primary control center of the Petroleos de Venezuela, PDVSA refinery, always rattled. It was a rhythmic, mechanical wheeze that the night shift operators had long ago tuned out. It was 3:14 a.m. on a Saturday in mid-December. Outside, the heavy, humid air of the Caribbean coast settled over the sprawling labyrinth of distillation columns, flare stacks, and miles of pressurized pipelines. Inside, the glow of a dozen human-machine interface screens bathed the room in a pale blue light. Mateo, a senior SCADA engineer with bags under his eyes, rubbed his temples. He was staring at a pressure telemetry graph on a monitor running an aging, unpatched version of Windows. Like everything else in the facility, the software was a ghost ship. International sanctions meant no official support, no fresh licenses, and no security patches. They were running on a multi-billion-dollar energy infrastructure with nothing but duct tape and institutional memory. Deep within the network, buried in a forgotten directory on a legacy server, a sleeper awoke. It was a small batch script, dormant since it had been meticulously compiled back in late September. It had waited patiently through the autumn, surviving server reboots and superficial scans of outdated antivirus software. So now, its internal timer struck zero. The script, named osyncnow.bat, stretched its digital legs. It didn't immediately attack. It was designed by professionals. It was designed to be quiet, precise, and absolutely devastating. First, the script asked a single fatal question. Where am I? It queried the local network domain. If the answer had been anything else, the script would have quietly terminated, a ghost dissolving into the ether to avoid collateral damage. But the server responded with the target it had been hard-coded to destroy, PDVSA.com. Target confirmed, weapons free. The script's first offensive move was an assassination in the dark. It reached into the operating system's registry and strangled the U10 detect, the Windows Interactive Services detection. If the malware had a face, it would have been pulling a black hood over the operating system's head. Now, whatever happened next, the system would not throw up a single error dialog box. Matteo and his team would receive no warning. Next, the malware reached out across the network, feeling for the net logon share, hunting for a specific remote XML file. It found the pathways open. It checked the local C Lotus directory. The environment was perfect. At 3:19 a.m., the second stage deployed. This was the point of no return. At his console, Matteo blinked. The telemetry graph on his screen froze. He clicked his mouse. The cursor sat dead in the center of the screen. He tapped the spacebar. Nothing. "Hey, Lewis," Matteo called out over the hum of the air conditioner. "Did the historian server just hang again?" "I've got a frozen HMI." Lewis, sitting 2 rows down, frowned at his own monitors. "Wait, my session just dropped. It logged me out." Lewis typed in his credentials and hit enter. Access denied. Account disabled. "What the?" Lewis muttered, trying the administrator override. Access denied. Across the network, the Lotus Wiper's second batch script was moving with terrifying speed. It wasn't just logging users out. It was severing the spinal cord of that facility. It systematically deactivated every network interface it could touch. The servers were suddenly isolated in the dark, unable to talk to each other, unable to warn the outside world. Then, the malware brought out the heavy machinery. It didn't rely on exotic custom code built tools that might be caught by a stray security protocol here or there. Instead, it turned Windows's own native tools against itself. It triggered disk park clean all, aiming straight for the logical drives. It summoned robocopy, commanding it to recursively mirror empty, void directories over the top of the company's most critical operational folders. It was digital acid, eating away decades of engineering schematics, accounting ledgers, and operational databases. And just to ensure the victim couldn't stitch themselves back together, the script invoked FSUtil. It commanded the system to create a massive, empty file, bloating it continuously until it consumed 100% of the hard drive's free space. The physical drives spun frantically, their platters screaming as they filled with absolutely nothing, choking out any possibility of a system restore. In the control room, the blue glow of the HMIs began to vanish. One by one, the monitors flickered, threw up fatal boot errors, and went black. "Matteo," Lewis shouted, standing up in his chair, clattering backwards. "We're losing the PLCs. I have no visibility on the distillation columns. The whole board is going dark." Matteo grabbed the red emergency landline on his desk, his heart hammering against his ribs. He punched the button for the IT operations center in Caracas. The line was dead. The voice over IP network had been housed on the same infrastructure. The final phase of the attack had begun. The Lotus Wiper launched. It hunted down the volume shadow copies and slaughtered them. It cleared the update journals, wiping its own footprints from the snow. Finally, it began writing raw zeros directly to the physical sectors of those disks. It was autonomizing the data. It wasn't encrypting it for ransom. It was erasing the past, present, and future of the facility. Hit the manual overrides, Matteo ordered, his voice tight with an ancient primal panic. Get the yard teams on the radios, shut down the intake valves all manually. If we can't see the pressure limits, we are flying a bomb. Blind. By 4 a.m., the digital silence was absolute. The attack had successfully jumped from the IT administrative network directly into the OT management layer. The entire administrative apparatus of the National Oil Company, payroll, shipping logistics, export tracking, and SCADA management was gone. As the sun rose over the Caribbean, painting the sky in violet shades of orange and red, the refinery stood paralyzed. The mighty hum of the pipelines began to quiet as manual emergency shutdowns took effect. Ships waiting in the harbor for crude oil would sit idle. Inside the stifling control room, Matteo sat illuminated only by the morning light bleeding through his blinds. His multi-million-dollar console was a brick. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his personal smartphone, and opened WhatsApp to message his supervisor. Beside him, Lewis was frantically writing down pressure gauge readings on a yellow legal pad, radioing them frantically to engineers across the compound. The attack had lasted less than an hour, but the recovery of it was, if it was even possible, would take months. The Zeros had won. Okay, that was a fictionalized story of the events that actually took place. Names were changed to protect the innocent. And after listening to that dramatized segment like the one we just went through with the Lotus wiper, you might be asking yourself, why take the time to write a techno-thriller narrative? We're professionals. Why not just stick to the CVEs, the indicators of compromise, and the technical logs? It's a fair question, but in my experience, stretching back over nearly 3 decades in security and navigating the complexities of modern critical infrastructure, I've learned that raw data only tells half the story. People have to listen. Here's exactly why I use narrative storytelling on CyberSecureOT. 1, I like to translate abstract threats into visceral reality. I like to, 2, bridge the gap between policy and the plant floor, as you can hear through the story. 3, building better tabletop exercises, because you can use these scenarios. And 4, I like to stress test my own core methodology that I've been working on for a few years. So continue on, and you will hear the latest in OT cybersecurity news. Okay, if you paused after the story, welcome back. Let's get right into my second segment. Long before I was dissecting advanced threat actors or building out incident response services for the maritime sector, I spent a lot of my time in my dad's shop turning wrenches. I remember building a 351 Windsor engine from the block up that I put in a 1987 Ranger pickup truck. That truck was stupid fast, and it loved to switch ends on me right up until I flipped it over in the rain. But the engine survived, so I pulled it out, souped it up even more, and dropped it straight into a 1990 Isuzu pickup. When you spend enough time building physical machines, or later on pulling combat communications for the Air Guard, configuring and troubleshooting multiplexers, satellite connections, switchboard systems, you learn a fundamental, unforgiving truth about complex architecture. The core engine, the main switch, or the primary node rarely fails on its own. It is almost always the supply lines. You can build a bulletproof engine block or deploy the most hardened telecommunications hub in the theater, but if an adversary contaminates the fuel line or intercepts the signal upstream, the entire system seizes up. You are dead in the water. Right now, in the software world, we are seeing the exact same principle being weaponized digitally. This week, the industry got a brutal lesson in supply chain contamination. Let's talk about the Bitwarden CLI compromise. CLI is Command Level Interface. First, let's establish the blast radius so no one panics unnecessarily. If you use the Bitwarden password manager on your phone, your desktop, or on your web browser, your vault data is safe. The core production systems and the web infrastructure were not breached. What got hit was a highly specific developer-focused tool, the Bitwarden command line interface. Specifically, the npm package at Bitwarden/CLI version 2206.4.0. Between roughly 5:57 p.m. and 7:30 p.m. Eastern on April 22nd, a malicious version of that package sat active on the npm registry. It was only up for about an hour and a half before it was then detected and deprecated. But in the world of automated CI/CD pipelines, 90 minutes is an absolute eternity. So remember, CI/CD stands for continuous integration, continuous deployment, or continuous delivery, and it's a term used to describe modern-day software deployments. Let's put our gray hats on and tear down exactly how this happened, because the execution here is both genius and frightening. The attackers, widely suspected to be a threat group known as the Team PCP, didn't try to kick down Bitwarden's front door. They went after the fuel line. They leveraged a compromised GitHub action within Bitwarden's CI/CD pipeline. Based on the analysis from Socket and JFrog, it appears they exploited the Checkmarx AST-GitHub-action. Software developers will understand what this means. This is a continuation of a massive ongoing supply chain campaign that has previously targeted Docker images, the Kix infrastructure as a code scanner, and the Trivy security scanner. So if you use those, you should be paying attention. By compromising that GitHub action, the attackers successfully injected a malicious file called bw1.js. They injected that directly into the legitimate Bitwarden CLI package. When a developer or an automated build server pulled that package down, it didn't just passively sit there. It triggered a custom loader called bw_setup.js. This script is incredibly clever. First, it checks the local environment to see if a package manager called bun is installed. If bun isn't there, the script doesn't just error out and fail. It actually reaches out to GitHub, downloads the bun runtime natively, and installs it. Automation is great. It guarantees it has the exact execution environment it needs to launch the primary payload. Once bw1.js executes via bun, it moves immediately into persistence and evasion. It injects payloads into your bash RC and ZS HRC shell profiles and drops a lock file in the temporary directory to prevent duplicate executions from making too much noise. Then it does something very interesting. It checks the system locale. If your machine's locale or environment variables start with RU, designating Russia, the malware silently terminates. What does that mean? It's a classic geographical geofence kill switch to avoid poking the local bear. If you aren't geofenced, the harvesting begins. When I was securing research, development, testing, and evaluation systems for the Navy under the DITSCAP framework, we assumed the perimeter was always contested. We couldn't rely solely on software updates. We relied heavily on network segmentation, strict access controls, and isolating the databases, because if an adversary got into a shipboard system or near a SCADA network, they were going to scrape memory and look for lateral movement keys. That is exactly what this payload does in the developer's machine. It was up for 90 minutes, folks. It isn't looking for your Bitwarden passwords. It is looking for the keys to the kingdom. It scrapes runner.worker memory from GitHub and from personal access tokens. It dives into your hidden directories, looks for AWS credentials in an .aws folder, Azure tokens via AZD, GCP credentials, SSH private keys, and NPM publishing tokens, all the stuff that your credentials hide in. Crucially, it also hunts for configuration files tied to AI coding assistants like Claude, Cursor, and MCP. Threat actors know that developers are feeding proprietary architecture and API keys into these AI assistants to generate code. Those AI configurations are the new gold mine. Classic supply chain compromise. Now, how do they get this data out? This is where the tradecraft gets highly theatrical. The primary exfiltration method is standard. It encrypts the stolen secrets. I think it's AES 256 GCM and ships them off to command and control servers, C2. Then it intentionally impersonates Checkmarx. This is a specific type of a site. So it's audit.checkmarx, basically. But if you have a proper egress filtering setup in place, then that connection drops. So the malware falls back to a highly unconventional method. It's not done yet. It takes your stolen GitHub token, logs into your GitHub account, and spins up public repositories under your name. It dumps the encrypted data into those repos, embeds the stolen tokens right into the commit messages. And they left a distinct calling card. The attackers used a naming convention for these staging repositories pulled straight out of the sci-fi novel Dune. This is where it's so much fun, very theatrical. We're talking a repo with the name of Fremen, repos named Sandworm and Mentat. The debug things, strings and repository descriptions reference like Shah Hulud, the Third Coming, and the Butlerian Jihad. It's overt ideological branding embedded right into the supply chain. And yes, I called it a worm because it is. This thing is entirely self-propagating. Once it steals your NPM tokens, it maps out what other packages you have write access to, then automatically weaponizes those tokens to inject malicious pre-install hooks into your other projects, republishing them to infect anyone downstream of you. It is an automated cascading failure. So Bitwarden just pulled it, but once this thing's in there, man, it is crazy. It is infested. When I was writing my PhD dissertation on the DoD information security process, the core dilemma was always trust. It was about performance-based outsourcing and change agents, basically. How do you trust the tools that you outsource or the people? The Bitwarden compromise perfectly illustrates the modern evolution of that problem. As an OT cyber practitioner, I review new security products for process control environments. I look at supply chain attacks like this and see an immediate existential threat to industrial environments where organizations use CI/CD. When I was building that maritime managed security service with partners, we worked with an LPG shipping carrier. That was the first thing we locked down, that connection. How we're going to get the packages in and out to those ships. As a compromised CLI tool onshore eventually could mean a compromised tool control room offshore, possibly. So if a developer at an oil and gas supermajor or a contractor managing deep water production facilities installs that tainted NPM package, that individual becomes patient zero. The attacker suddenly has persistent workflow injection access to every CI/CD pipeline that developer's token can reach. Your automated compliance scripts or your OT incident response tools could end up pushing trojanized code directly out to the physical plant. This is exactly why we apply core methodology. It's got to be cost-effective, operational, reliable, and efficient to our security programs. You cannot just throw expensive blinky boxes at a supply chain problem, and you cannot build a risk program assuming you can simply patch your way out of trouble. In OT, we survive on compensating controls, architectural resilience, and zero trust principles. The same must apply to your development environments. So what is operational response? If your environment pulled at Bitwarden/CLI version 2026.4.0 on April 22nd, you have to treat it as a catastrophic credential exposure event. You must purge the NPM cache. You must rip and replace every single secret that was on that machine or accessible to that pipeline. Rotate your AWS access keys. Invalidate your GitHub PATs, roll your SSH keys, and heavily review your Azure Key Vault and GCP Secret Manager access logs. These are the main cloud providers. You also need to audit your GitHub organization immediately. Look for unauthorized repository creation, especially anything looking like a Dune reference, like Shahilad, and inspect your GitHub action workflows for unauthorized runs or branches. Long term, you have to architecturally restrict your pipelines, enforce least privileged access for your GitHub actions, strictly limit egress traffic from your build servers, and use short-lived credentials wherever possible. A supply line is only as secure as its weakest link. Whether it's fuel flowing to a swapped 351 Windsor, a wideband system communicating with a satellite, or an NPM package building your incident response tools, if you don't defensively engineer your pipeline, you don't control the outcome. Take a breath, check your logs, and we'll be right back with our next segment. Welcome back. We are moving into segment 3. If you're just joining us, I'm your host, Dennis Hackney. Mid-set introduction, and as a quick disclaimer for any of you new listeners, yes, I am Dr. Dennis Hackney, but I'm not a medical doctor, so if your industrial control system is bleeding out from a zero-day exploit, I'm your guy. If you have a physical or medical emergency, please hang up, call 911. In this segment, we are putting our gray hats on to take a technical deep dive into the devastating piece of malware that recently struck the energy sector in Venezuela. This is called the Lotus Wiper. As I am currently employed at a super major oil and gas company, threats targeting global energy infrastructure always command my immediate attention. The stakes in operational technology are highly kinetic, and the consequences of a compromised energy grid or refinery are very immediate. So let's take a look at the threat model. When we analyze events like this through CORE, my cybersecurity methodology, focusing on cost-effective, operational, reliable, and efficient security practices, I say that a lot, the first thing we establish is intent. This was not a ransomware play. There was no extortion note, no cryptocurrency wallet address left on a compromised desktop screen. Lotus Wiper had one singular objective: unrecoverable system destruction. The timeline of the operation is fascinating as well. Technical evidence shows the Wiper payload was compiled in late September of 2025, but the actual detonation happened in mid-December. That tells us that the adversaries breached the domain months in advance. In my nearly 30 years of experience in the defense sector, we refer to this as advanced operational preparation of the environment. You don't just drop a wiper blind. You map out the network. You understand the Active Directory structure, and you tailor your ordinance. And tailored it was. Let's dissect the execution chain. The attack initiates with a batch script. That is a text-based file that when it's run, it's got usually a .bat, like batch at the end. It could have a .cmd, but when it's run, it opens up a command line interface like on Windows, and it starts executing just as if somebody was typing in commands in that command line interface. So this batch script was named osyncnow.bat. The most critical aspect of this script is its targeting governor. The attackers hard-coded the domain name of Venezuela's state-owned oil company, PDVSA.com, directly into the script. This is a precision strike mechanism. If the malware executes checks the local domain and it's not PDVSA.com, the script exits. It terminates. It's an intentional safeguard to prevent the malware from spilling over into non-target networks. In my courses as an adjunct professor at Texas A&M School of Law, we spend a lot of time kind of talking about regulatory policy, and sometimes I bring up OT as well. The presence of a hard-coded domain is a massive indicator of sophisticated, potentially state-aligned behavior. This is the kind of stuff that we don't want to see. It's specifically designed to limit collateral damage and avoid triggering international kinetic responses from neighboring networks. This kind of has state actor on it. Once the script verifies it's inside the PDVSA network, It moves to suppress a very specific legacy Windows component, the Interactive Services Detection Service, or UI0 detect. It's either UI0 or U10 detect. For the technical folks listening, you know that Microsoft deprecated this after Windows 10, version 1803, I think. The service alerts a user if a background process tries to interact with the desktop. By disabling it, the attackers ensured their wiper would run silently because there'd be no notification. But more importantly, the fact that they included a command to kill the U10 detect proves they knew exactly what the environment that they were targeting was. Due to heavy international sanctions, Venezuela's tech infrastructure, they're trapped in amber. They are running legacy unpatched systems. The attackers did their reconnaissance and weaponized the victims' technical debt against them. They knew this was not going to be updated. From there, the script hunts for a net logon share, which is very common in Windows. It attempts to access a remote XML, extensible markup language file, which this is a text-based file too. And it checks for a corresponding local directory, usually placed in C, which is the main hard drive on any computer, by default, under a folder named Lotus. This is a domain enumeration tactic to confirm it has the necessary reach across the Active Directory environment. The Active Directory is, remember, the PDVSA.com directory. That's the domain. That has all the identities. That's where the computers connect to. That's where they all live. If the remote file isn't found, or the share is unreachable, the script introduces a randomized sleepy delay of up to 20 minutes before retrying. It's very patient. When the environment is finally prepped, the second batch script drops. This is where the Scorched Earth campaign begins. It enumerates local user accounts. Remember, it's got your Active Directory. Immediately disables cached logins and forcefully logs off interactive or active sessions. They don't have to be interactive. Then it cuts the cord by deactivating the network interfaces. The target is now blind, deaf, and locked out of their own box. The attackers then heavily utilize the living off the land binaries, native Windows tools repurposed for destruction, essentially. The script executes a disk part clean on all command to wipe all logical drives. It uses the robocopy command line utility to recursively mirror empty directories over existing folders, and then it systematically overwrites all those contents. It leverages fsutil, this is for disk utilities, to bloat a dummy file until it consumes 100% of your available storage space, ensuring that even if you tried to recover, the drive has zero capacity to process any operations. So it's already blank, it's already overwritten, and it has no capacity. Finally, the Lotus Wiper executable itself is launched. It didn't even happen yet. It deletes all volume shadow copies and restore points. It writes zeros directly to the physical sectors of the drive. This reminds me of a government wipe. We used to have to wipe disks and we'd have to rewrite things like 7 times with ones and zeros. It clears the update sequence number, or USN, journals, completely erasing the forensic footprint of the file system and any changes that took place. When it finishes, the machine isn't just broken, the data is atomized, excuse me. The impact on PDVSA was catastrophic. While official statements tried to downplay the incident as a minor administrative disruption, the reality on the ground was that export operations were halted. Bloomberg reported that the SCADA systems managing refinery processes, compression plants, and pipelines were severely affected. Workers were reduced to managing a national oil company via Telegram, WhatsApp, and handwritten notes because the accounting, payroll, and production platforms, they were all completely wiped out. So what is the operational takeaway here? If we apply principles like my core methodology, the defense strategy against this type of sophisticated wiper must center on behavioral monitoring and lateral containment. Relying purely on signature-based antivirus is a losing battle against a custom-compiled wiper without a known hash, and plus their antivirus was outdated. Security operations centers must closely monitor anomalous execution of administrative tools such as diskpart and robocopy, especially when triggered sequentially by an unrecognized batch script. That should never happen. Furthermore, segmenting your IT and OT networks, that's a non-negotiable. If an attacker can pivot from an administrative IT network or the enterprise IT domain directly into a SCADA system, remember that's supervisory control and data acquisition, that's for control systems, the architectural design is fundamentally flawed. This attack is a stark reminder that critical infrastructure is a modern battlefield. The code was precise, the reconnaissance was thorough, and the destruction was absolute. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll wrap up this episode with some final thoughts on how AI-driven security operations might be the key to catching these living off the land tactics before the wiper payload ever executes. So make sure you stick around. Okay, if you're just tuning back in, this is the final segment 4 of today's episode. I'm your host, Dennis, and in this segment, we're going to tackle a topic that is quite literally the foundation of everything we do in operational technology. We are talking about visibility. Now, if you've spent any time with me at work or if you've listened to this show for a while, you know my background. I didn't start my career in a pristine climate-controlled security operations center looking at a wall of glass and monitors. That's not me. I started with helmets or hard hats, steel-toed boots, and ear protection. I was the guy trying to bridge the gap between the IT network engineers who wanted to patch everything on Patch Tuesday and the crusty they weren't all crusty, plant people or plant managers who looked at me like I was holding a live grenade when I suggested that we safely scan a network. I've spent the better part of 2 decades dealing with legacy gear. And that does include things like networks with PLCs that have been running since the Clinton administration, or remote terminal units, communications sitting outside remote substations, and HMI panels running operating systems that Microsoft abandoned before some of my current junior analysts were even born. So when the conversation turns to OT visibility, I don't look at it as an academic exercise. I look at it through the lens of a practitioner. You cannot protect what you cannot see. I didn't make up that catchphrase. It's a cliche, I know, but it's a cliche because it's absolute. Unvarnished, it's the truth. Today, we're going to look at the federal government, specifically NIST and CISA. They are finally building out a cohesive, practical set of services and guidance to help us solve this visibility crisis. And folks, I call it a crisis for a reason. So NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, CISA, Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. When I say federal, I'm talking about the United States. Let's rewind the clock just a little bit to August of 2025. CISA, in collaboration with the NSA, the FBI, and the EPA, and a host of international partners, released a very specific document. August 2025, Foundations of OT Cybersecurity Asset Inventory Guidance for Owners and Operators, aptly named. When I read that title last year, my first thought was, it's about time. Asset inventory is the first control in almost every cybersecurity framework on the planet. And it's nice that they have frameworks. I would say that they don't always apply straight out of the box, but it's good that they are working on it. It's right there in the CIS control number 1. That's the Center of Internet Security. It's like they have top 18 security controls or something. It's the identify function in the NIST cybersecurity framework. Yet for OT practitioners, achieving a credible asset inventory has always been our Everest. So why? Because in IT, you can just run an active network scanner, throw a Nessus or Nmap at a subnet and see what pings back. If you do that on an OT network, you might knock over a fragile control device like a PLC that was deployed or designed in the early 2000s. You might cause a robotic arm on a manufacturing line to halt, or in some cases, move. It could swing out of control. So, I've never done that. But from a situation earlier in my career, I did read about an overly aggressive IT vulnerability scanner that found its way past a misconfigured firewall, blue screened a critical control system. So the downtime cost was very high, and the safety risk was also very high. So we try to avoid that. So that's why the CISA guidance from August 2025 was pretty important. It finally provided federal validation for what we practitioners have been screaming for years. OT requires a different approach. The guidance heavily emphasized passive monitoring, hooking up to span, or these are passive ports, or using a tap, which a tap goes in line on industrial switches to listen to the traffic rather than interrogating the devices directly. So we're just pulling the data from the network, but we're not actively scanning. It urged organizations to finally pull back the curtain on the black box, or their OT environments. But guidance that's just paper, remember? Telling us to do it is one thing, giving us the practical architecture to actually do it is where they sometimes fall short. So this brings us to right now, April 2026. Just a few days ago, the Federal News Network broke the story that the National Institute of Standards and Technology, specifically their National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, they do really great things here. NCCOE, they did a lot of work with a lot of prime vendors, including AWS and Azure, on zero trust frameworks, designing networks for zero trust 4 years ago or so. NCCOE, they're launching a brand new project focused explicitly on helping critical infrastructure organizations gain better visibility into their OT environments. So that's pretty cool because they're going to actually put technologies in place to do this in a lab. Sherilyn Pascoe, the director of the NCCOE, noted that they are launching this OT visibility project after spending the last few years working on sector-specific efforts, such as water and wastewater. So those are public services, so they need the help. So let me translate why this is a huge undertaking, or why this is huge for us in general. The NCCOE doesn't just write policy; they build the labs. They partner with vendors. They partnered with vendors like Dragos, the Clarities, the Nozomis, the Microsofts, the Rockwells. I already told you, like AWS, and they build out reference architectures. They actually test how to integrate these visibility tools without breaking the industrial process. For years, asset owners have told me, Dennis, we want to deploy an OT networking monitoring tool, but we don't have the budget to do it. And we don't have the budget to do a massive proof of concept to make sure it won't disrupt our latency sensitive devices like our Profinet network. This new NIST project is going to do just that. They're going to do the heavy lifting for us. They're going to figure out the best practices for capturing that visibility data, managing the alerts, and most importantly, making sense of it all. So this is really cool because they're building this out. Because here is the dirty little secret of OT visibility. Once you turn the lights on, the room is usually very, very messy. You deploy a passive sensor, and suddenly you realize your air-gapped network has 3 unauthorized cellular modems, a vendor remote access VPN that's been active for 3 years, and devices communicating over plain text protocols like Modbus, TCP, or DMP3 if it's electrical. You'll also see where their protocols are messy. Like from an IT perspective, we think they're messy, but they work perfectly fine in the OT sense. So it's basically opening up that dusty closet and knocking all the cobwebs out of it. The NIST project aims to create a standardized way to consume that visibility. So that's cool. And it builds beautifully on the sector-specific work like water and wastewater that they've been doing. Speaking of the sector-specific work, I want to pivot to a perfect example of how NIST is taking the broad concepts of cybersecurity framework, like the new version 2.0, and translating them into our world. So earlier this year, early 2026, the NCCOE released a draft of the NIST internal report. It's called 8576. They always do these four-digit numbers. It's called the Transit Cybersecurity Framework Community Profile. And so I hadn't been following NCCOE enough. So now I'm looking at it again. Even if you don't work in the transportation sector, pay attention because this is the blueprint for how NIST is going to help all of us. This is transit agencies. These are fascinating. They're kind of terrifying. They're a microcosm of OT and IT convergence. Transportation. So think about a major metropolitan subway system. You have traditional IT. These are the ticketing servers, the passenger Wi-Fi, human resource databases, things like that. But then you have the heavy OT, the signaling systems, the train control networks. Think about the switching stations. Positive train control is what they call them, PTC. These are SCADA systems managing traction power for the third rail and life safety ventilation systems in tunnels. If a train stops in a tunnel and if there's a fire and you don't have proper ventilation, everybody could end up perishing in that tunnel. In transit, the stakes aren't just data loss. The stakes are kinetic. It's human lives. It's trains colliding or derailing possibly if somebody takes over that PST or the switching stations. What NIST did with this community profile was engage directly with the transit operators to map the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0 specifically to the transit mission. They created a voluntary risk-based approach tailored to the exact operational and safety requirements that are moving millions of people a day. So as an OT security guy, what I love about community profiles, and a profile is basically how it applies to a certain sector, how the cybersecurity framework applies to a certain sector. But what I love about them is that they cut out the translation layer, so you don't have to figure that out for yourself. If I hand the standard NIST cybersecurity framework to a transit operator or a manager, they're going to look at it at the protect function and say, well, how does this apply to RF communications between the train and the trackside transponder? The community profile answers that. It tells them exactly which visibility and protection controls map to those specific physical systems. How cool is that? NIST is using these profiles to essentially say, we know OT is not a monolith. It's not the same everywhere. The visibility requirements for a transit agency are different from a water utility, which are different from a petroleum refinery. By building out these community profiles, NIST is providing us, the practitioners, with a tailored checklist that we can take to the board and say, this isn't just Dennis's opinion. This is the community standard for our specific industry. So believe me, having that federal standard backing you up is one of the easier ways to get some budget. It doesn't always work, but they might finally approve it if they see that there's a federal government behind it. But we can't talk about visibility and the future of OT security in 2026 without addressing a massive algorithmic elephant in the room, artificial intelligence. So I've got to pivot to AI almost every episode now. You've got vendors pushing AI. You've got the White House warning about nation states stealing our AI models. And right now, as you and I are having this conversation, because I know you're listening to me, the NCCOE is heavily focused on NIST IR 8596. 4 numbers. The Cybersecurity Framework Profile for Artificial Intelligence. You can see all this linked in my notes. This is the Cyber AI Profile. They've been running workshops throughout January and April of this year to finalize this draft. And you might be asking, Dennis, I'm trying to keep a 20-year-old Siemens S7 PLC from falling over. Why do I care about AI? You care about AI because it is going to fundamentally change both how you are attacked and how you achieve visibility. Let's look at what the NCCOE is focusing on for Cyber AI Profile. They break it down into a few areas, including securing AI system components, thwarting AI-enabled cyber attacks, and conducting AI-enabled cyber defense. From the practitioner's viewpoint, the attacker side is concerning. But I agree with some of the recent industry analysis, so like what Dragos put out recently, that some of the hype around AI-generated malware, specifically targeting OT protocols, is a bit overblown right now. It still takes engineering knowledge to know what registers to change in a PLC to cause a centrifuge to spin out of control, and sometimes very specific knowledge of that facility. But AI doesn't magically teach an attacker these physics. It just makes things happen much more quickly. Where AI is absolutely critical for us is in the conducting AI-enabled cyber defense. So this is where we really want to make improvements. Let's go back to our core problem, visibility. When you finally deploy your passive monitoring across a massive manufacturing plant, you are instantly hit with a fire hose of data. Millions of packets, baseline communications, asset discovery logs. An OT security team is usually tiny, maybe 2 or 3 people if you're lucky to have one at all. They cannot manually parse through that much telemetry. This is where the concepts in the NIST Cyber AI profile become our lifeline. We need AI and advanced machine learning to ingest that visibility data, baseline the known good state of the industrial processes, and alert us to the anomalies. If a human-machine interface typically reads out data from a PLC once a second, and suddenly a new device on the network tries to write firmware to that PLC at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, the AI-driven visibility tool needs to flag it instantly. But, and this is the massive but for the OT folks, the NIST Cyber AI profile also highlights the risks of trusting AI too much. In IT, if an AI security tool spots a ransomware behavior, it might automatically isolate the server. You cannot let AI unilaterally decide to isolate a safety instrumented system in a chemical plant. For example, the risk of the AI making a false positive and shutting down a critical cooling system is unacceptable. So the NIST profile helps organizations to navigate this exact tightrope. It gives us a framework to implement AI for visibility and anomaly detection while keeping the human in the loop. For the actual response, like in the control room for control actions, humans need to do that. So it bridges the gap between the bleeding edge technology of 2026 and the cold, hard physical realities of the plant floor. So what is the takeaway here for you? The practitioner, the one who's listening right now, the person sitting in your truck outside of a substation or sitting in the control room drinking your 3rd cup of coffee. The takeaway is that the excuses are gone. 5 years ago, we could say that OT visibility was too hard, too risky, and lacked standardized guidance. But today, April 2026, CISA has given us the mandate and the foundational guidance for OT asset inventory. The NCCOE has provided customized sector-specific blueprints like the transit profile. They are building a dedicated OT visibility project to test those architectures, and they are giving us the Cyber AI profile to safely use advanced tools to manage the data we collect. If the federal government is building these rails, we can use them. It is up to us to drive the train. If you haven't looked at the August 2025 CISA asset inventory guidance, go download it to my links. If you are in transit, review the NIST IR 8576 and keep a very close eye on this NCCOE OT visibility project. Participate in the public comment periods. They actually listen to the comments. They read the comments. When you tell them, hey, this control won't work in a high latency satellite SCADA environment, they take the feedback and they try to adapt for that. Visibility, well, they might also realize it if you're lying too. So they'll take good constructive feedback. Visibility is no longer a luxury in OT. It is the absolute bare minimum. It's the table stakes for defending our critical infrastructure. We finally have the tools and the blueprints to turn the lights on. It's getting better, but we have to get to work. We can join in. But that wraps up my deep dive into OT visibility, and this brings this episode to a close. This is Dennis. I'm telling you thank you so much for listening. Until next time, keep your operations reliable, keep your network secure, and be sure to stay tuned for more educational content here on CyberSecureOT.